Hi, my name is Mark, and today I'm going to walk you through all the steps needed to make the Lakefield Cowl designed by J.H. Walter for Blue Sky Fibers. Let's start by looking at this pattern on Ravelry. Here I am on Ravelry.com, and I'm typing in Lakefield Cowl into my search box. And fortunately, that takes us to the exact pattern we're looking for. If you're on Ravelry and you're trying to narrow down your search, you can use the filter column on the left to narrow things down, but in this case, we don't need that. Here I am on the project page. I can save it to my favorites here on the right, and I see that this pattern is a free download, which is great. I'll take a second to look at the pictures. I think this is a really beautiful project, something versatile that you could wear throughout the year. It's fairly lightweight, but the colors are fun and bright. So here I'll look at the details of the weight of yarn, calls for sport, and then the needle size, which is a US 4 or 3.5 millimeter. It gives us the yardage needed, but obviously we have several colors involved here, so I'm going to take a look at the specific requirements needed once we're on the project. Here, under the Projects tab, we can see a few people that have made this and posted their results. I'm looking here at Annie's, and it's funny, she says, love the finished product, but not a fun knit, and that she skipped the final repeat of the colors. I did the exact same thing. I'll talk about that later in the video. If you feel like it's dragging on, I felt like the cowl was plenty long, so I stopped it a little early. Here we go. This pattern calls for Metalico, which is a really beautiful yarn. It's 50% silk, 50% baby alpaca from the company Blue Sky Fibers. And here I'm showing you each color we'll use. I'll put these details in the description box below, but the pattern calls for 3 skeins of the white, Opal, and then 1 each of Lapis, Gold Topaz, Carnelian Red, and Jade. You could do this out of other yarn, but I think specifically this pattern works really well with this yarn, both for the colors and for the feel of it. So if you're interested in buying the colors, I have a link to my local yarn shop in the description box that'll take you to the page where you can purchase these. Here we go, we're going to start by making a slip knot. I'm making my slip knot so that I can tug on the tail to close the knot, which allows me later in the project to tidy up that first stitch or the first join once I'm working in the round. And now I'm going to begin my cast on. So following that first slip knot, which counts as stitch number 1, we're going to cast on a total of 205 stitches. The pattern doesn't give us a specific cast on, so you can use any cast on you like. It doesn't necessarily need to be stretchy, as the stitch used for this garment isn't a stretchy stitch like a rib or even a stockinette knit. We're using the linen stitch throughout, so feel free to use whatever cast on you like. I'm using a cabled cast on here. I like the edge it gives. Alright, after I have my stitches cast on, I'll come back and we'll join this in the round. Remember, we're casting on 205 stitches. I'm almost to 205 stitches cast on, and so I'll take a second to spread out my work. If you're working on circular needles, they give you the space to spread your stitches before connecting in the round, and as I'm casting on at least, my stitches are really bunched, so I've spread those out, and now I'll do my final few stitches to get me to 205 stitches total. At this point, I'll be joining my work in the round. And when you only have a cast on your needles, it can be a little confusing to join in the round or figure out which way your work is turning or facing. You can see here as I worked, my cast on row has twisted quite a bit. So I'm just taking a moment to spread out those stitches and make sure that they are all facing the same direction. That the edge of my cast on is at the bottom of my needles closest to my body, and that the live stitches, the top of each stitch, is facing away or in front of me. You can see me untwisting quite a bit. If I were to join in the round before untwisting, then whatever I'm making, whether it be a cowl or a sweater, the actual work will be twisted as many times as your cast on is twisted. So this step is really important. Take the time to set your work down in front of you, spread your stitches out, and make sure that nothing is twisted before you join. Now with my cast on, I actually added one extra stitch, and it's something I would recommend. So I'm taking one stitch from my right needle, moving it to the left, and then passing the next stitch on my left needle over that extra stitch as if to cast off or decrease. And then I'm able to pull my first tail to secure that. And this is just joining my work in a sturdier way. Now I've placed a marker for my beginning of round, and I'll begin my stitch pattern. Our pattern repeat consists of 2 rows and 2 stitches across those 2 rows. The first stitch is a knit, and the second stitch is a slip with the yarn held in front. I'll zoom in just a moment and show this up close. So again, we are knitting the first stitch and then bringing our yarn to the front and slipping the second stitch. Here I am knitting. Then I'll bring my yarn to the front of the work and slip the next stitch purlwise without changing the orientation of that stitch. I knit one, bring the yarn to the front, and slip. Knit one, bring the yarn to the front, and slip. Now we have 205 stitches cast on for this project, and this odd number means that if we start the round with a knit one, we will finish the round with a knit one, meaning that round 2 of the project will begin with a slip stitch instead of a knit. At this point, I'm just about to reach my marker. As I mentioned, the final stitch of round 1 is a knit stitch, just working in pattern. Then I'll slip my marker and continue my pattern by bringing the yarn forward and slipping the next stitch. Then we knit. Then we bring the yarn forward and slip, and continue. So we're just working this pair of stitches back and forth through the whole project. And because of that odd number of stitches on our needles, each time we finish a round, we will finish with a knit. The next time we'll finish with a slip, the next with a knit, the next with a slip. So we never have to repeat a pair of the same stitches. We will never knit 2 stitches in a row, and we will never slip 2 stitches in a row. We will always alternate between a knit one, bringing the yarn forward, and slipping the next stitch purlwise. And that creates our linen stitch. We'll look more closely at the linen stitch texture later in the video. Here we're about to reach another beginning of round, so we'll take a close-up look. I'm finishing this round with a knit one, and then slipping the next stitch. We'll slip the marker, and then we'll continue in that pattern, knit one, and slip the next stitch. So we just keep going. It's very simple, easy to memorize, easy to start and stop this project. You'll always know where you are by looking at the last stitch you've done. And the repeats of colors work in sets of 6 rows or 6 rounds. So we begin with the white and we work 6 rounds before we change to color B. And then color B has 6 rounds. Then we go back to the white, you can see my completed project underneath this sample where we alternate. Now we can look a bit closer at the linen stitch. You can see the dashes of white in the colored sections, and those are the slip stitches with the yarn carried in front. It's the yarn that we're bringing to the front that's later becoming that sort of dash or hyphen. And I think it's really beautiful, especially at each color change. Let's look one more time at the stitch in slow motion. And you can see here what the stitches look like and how we can read our work. Following my slip stitch, I'm going to knit a stitch that is kind of tucked under the slip from the previous row. And now, what looks like a regular knit stitch will be slipped with our yarn carried in front. You can see the next stitch on my needle has yarn drawn in front of it, which means I should knit that stitch. In a worst case scenario, if you get out of your pattern and start knitting the stitches that have been knit in the previous round and slipping the previous slips, you should notice fairly quickly that you have columns of knit stitches and columns of sort of loose stitches with yarn gathered in front. So stop and check in with your work. Look and see if the stitch you're about to work has a strand drawn in front of it, or if it looks like a traditional knit. If you see the strand drawn in front, it means it's time to knit the stitch. And if you see something that looks like a knit, then you'll draw your yarn across and slip. So we're always alternating to get that woven linen look. At this point, I'll demonstrate how we change colors. As I mentioned before, or if you're looking at the pattern and making this in real time with me, you know that we change colors every 6 rounds. So that's a lot of changing, and it does leave us with a lot of ends that we'll talk about addressing later. So here I'm finishing the last few stitches. This is round 6 of my white row. I'll slip my marker, and then I will take my next color, which is the jade, and I'm going to leave about 6 to 8 inches of a tail, and I'm anchoring the yarn by wrapping it around my finger a couple of times. And the first stitch of any new color will always be a knit. So I go in to knit that stitch, making sure that I'm anchoring the loose tail on one of my fingers of the right hand. Then we slip the next stitch, knit, bring the yarn forward and slip, carrying forward in the pattern we've established. And once I've worked about 6 to 10 stitches, I'll drop that tail. It's secured at this point. However, when I come back to it on the next round, I'll have to be gentle in the first few stitches because that tail isn't yet anchored. Once I know my new color is joined, I'll take the previous color and leave about a 6 to 8 inch tail and cut that, just so things aren't getting tangled up as I work. So it's pretty straightforward. Just make sure you anchor that yarn as you join and pay attention to it on the following round or two so that it doesn't become too loose or stretched out. Now that we've covered all of the instructions you need, you can go forth making the rest of your cowl. Here I am taking a look at my cowl after I've done 4 repeats of the colors, and I feel like this is long enough. I've tried it on. I've been doing the linen stitch thousands of times, and I think I'm good. So like our friend on Ravelry mentioned, she stopped 1 repeat short of what the pattern calls for, and that's what I'm going to do too. You'll see in the pattern that we end with 1 more repeat of the white section, just to make our cowl balanced and symmetrical. And then we're instructed to bind off. We're not given any specific type of bind off, it just says bind off in pattern loosely. And I found when I was binding off that trying to do it in pattern was leaving me with gaps and extra bits of yarn kind of looping out on my bind off edge. And I didn't love that. So I went back and I substituted the final round of linen stitch for knitting every stitch just to even out my stitch size. And then I chose to bind off by knitting 2 stitches together through the back loop, and then slipping that stitch back to the left needle, knitting the next stitches together through the back loop, and repeating. It's a really common stretchy bind off. Again, we don't need this to have a lot of stretch because our linen stitch isn't a stretchy stitch, but we want to make sure we're not binding off any tighter than the circumference of the cowl. We'd like it to be straight up and down and as even as possible. So I was happy enough with this bind off. I definitely lose a little bit of definition at this end of the cowl because of my substitution for that final round of linen stitch, but to each their own. It's important that you're happy with your garment, and it's also important that you choose to knit things in a way that's comfortable and makes you feel confident and pleased with your results. So I think a lot of things allow for flexibility where we get to choose our own path as knitters. At this point, I'll continue with my bind off until I've completed all stitches, and then I'll talk a little bit about the ends and how we might weave those in. Here, after knitting my final 2 stitches together, I'll pull a larger loop up, grab my scissors, and I'll cut, again, about a 6 to 8 inch tail, and then I'll pull that stitch all the way through, securing the end of my work. And that end that we just pulled through will be where we start with our binding off. As for binding off, I like to use this set of tapestry needles from Tulip. These are the rounded tip version. They also have a sharp tip, kind of like a sewing needle. And it comes with a range of sizes. I use the largest one typically. And it's a good bit smaller than a lot of darning or tapestry needles for knitting, but it allows me to really bury my end, sometimes splitting existing stitches in the fabric so that my ends won't come out. So I start by folding the tail over the end of the needle, then pulling that through. So again, I'll take my strand, this is a sport weight, I'll fold it in 2 over the end of the needle, pinch that end, and then I can easily thread my tapestry needle. Once that's through, I'll start with my first end, which is the end of the bind off that we just finished. And I always like to give the strand a tug to make sure there's no extra slack, and I'm going to reach across to the stitch next to our final stitch. So kind of joining and reinforcing that end of round. And then I'll come through the back. I'm reaching a couple stitches past. And as I weave my ends in, if something looks off and I'm making a bigger mess, I can start over and just pull things back. But for an end like this where we need to seam up an existing join, I like to go over it several times until I feel that everything is really secure and it blends in as much as possible. Now once I have that joined, I'll start burying my end. So I'm going to head a few rows up into my project, pull that snug, And then I'm going to go back just next to that channel. And I'm trying to make sure to only pick up the topmost layer of stitches. I don't want what I'm doing to be seen on the reverse side. So I'm aiming to bury this end on the inside or the wrong side of the work. So I repeat this several times since it's the very edge of our project. I don't want this coming out. And at this point, you'll see me starting to split stitches. I'm really trying to bury things in a snug way so they won't go anywhere in the future. Once I'm happy with it, I'll cut pretty close to the fabric, which means when I block the final piece or steam it, however I choose to set it, that strand isn't going to come out of the project. It should stay nicely tucked in. And if the tail ever came out, we have about 6 to 8 inches there. After I trimmed it, we maybe have 4 or 5 inches, so there's still enough length that I could rescue it and resecure if needed. So looking at the inside, we have a ton of ends. I'm always really overwhelmed by this number of ends, and because this fiber is so slippery, it's 50% silk, 50% baby alpaca, it's difficult to weave in as we go. I think I feel more comfortable waiting until the very end to secure all of these. So brace yourself. You will hear several people swear that you should never tie a knot in anything that you've knit or crocheted. And then there are camps of people who say you should tie everything into knots and just bury them in your work. I'm not all the way across the line into that camp. I don't believe that everything should be knotted, but for a lightweight fiber like this that is extremely slick, I'm choosing to knot the joins from color to color together so that they don't go anywhere. After I tie these knots, I'm going to bury the ends with my tapestry needle, but I feel that just burying them with the tapestry needle without tying a knot could lead to those seams coming undone, and I think with a lot of wear and with a fiber this slick, we could end up with some of those ends escaping and leading to part of the project unraveling in the future. So, if you look at the inside of any of my sweaters I make, if the join is not at the cuff or an exposed edge of the garment, I'll often tie things into a gentle knot, and then I'll weave in my ends or I'll leave the ends to felt, because nobody's going to be looking at the very inside of my sweater except for me. So that's my rule of thumb. If the knots make you uncomfortable, if you're cringing as you watch this, then don't knot it. You can take the time to weave everything in very responsibly. But I make a lot of projects. I like to work swiftly. I don't want to rush my projects, but I like to work and get through my projects at a decent pace. So this is my solution for something like this. Hopefully this internal part of the cowl won't be exposed. We'll probably see the very edge flop forward, and that's where we've taken the time to carefully weave in, and we'll still weave in these tails after they're knotted, but I don't think at any point is this cowl going to become completely inverted for the knots to be visible. And again, the fiber is so lightweight that I don't think these small knots are going to be noticeable or felt when you're wearing this. Now I'll begin weaving in these tails. These are the tails that have been previously knotted. And I'm going to do this in a shortcut way by taking both strands, the white and the joining color, and threading them through my tapestry needle in tandem. This is essentially going to cut the number of tails I have in half, and it's going to speed up my finishing process. Now, as I mentioned, this is a shortcut. I know several knitters and crocheters that would never weave in their ends this way. They would take them all individually and make sure to bury them in a really responsible manner. And I'll say I'm not always the most responsible with my finishing. I think I'm going to do the job, and I think my finishing is going to be tidy and keep everything secure. But it's the inside of the work. And in my opinion, the inside of a work shouldn't be seen by everyone. People hopefully aren't going to take your sweater or your cowl and demand that you invert it and show them how you wove your ends in. So in this case where I have a ton of ends to weave in, it's worth it for me to double them up and weave them in, as long as I can do it in a way that doesn't take away from the rest of the project. And I'm being careful to pick up just the top layer of the fabric as I'm weaving these ends in, so that this isn't going to show on the correct side of the work. So here I have both ends through my tapestry needle. My white was cut pretty short, so I have to be a little bit more careful as I weave this in. I'm running it up a few stitches of a vertical channel in the fabric. And then I'm going to run back through almost that same channel, just catching a different stitch at the top. And then I'll pull to make sure everything is snug. And I will trim those, making sure as I trim them that they're not yanked in the work, nothing is puckering, but they can just lay flat and still be discreetly woven in. And as I do this, I'll make sure to check the correct side of the work to make sure that none of these colors are showing through. Here again, I'll take both tails, fold them over the top of the tapestry needle, thread them through together. And since I have a red strand and a white strand, you'll notice I'm going through the red stripe, because I think that taking this red tail through the white section would probably show through much faster than taking the white through the red section. And I drew them up one channel, back through the other direction, and I'll snip. So this goes by pretty quickly, and we're still securing our stitches, and remember, before we wove these ends in, we tied them in knots. If you hadn't tied the knots, or if you're making this and you don't choose to tie any knots, then I would take my end and I'd weave it back and forth at least 4 times instead of just the 2 I'm doing. And as I mentioned before, this is part of the joy of crafting, of making something from scratch. We get to choose the techniques we'd like to execute each project, and if you're doing something in a way that makes you feel confident and comfortable, then that's probably the way you should be doing it. Unless none of your projects are working out in the end, or you're always having issues where things come apart, you're probably doing things right. So I'll continue to weave these in, and that will be the finishing of this project. The fiber is so smooth and already looks very finished on the correct side that I doubt I'll need to do really any official blocking of the project. If you're not familiar, when you block a project, you typically soak the fabric in, I use warm water and some sort of wool wash if I'm using wool, and I'll leave that to bloom, or for the stitches to relax and the fiber to relax for about an hour. Then we press the water out, we lay the garment in the dimensions we want it to exist in, and then we leave things to dry. With this cowl, I don't think I'll need to do a formal blocking. I might lay it out and do a gentle steaming, just to get out any folds or creases from having it folded up in my project bag for the duration. So this is essentially all of the finishing work we need for this project. Thanks so much for sticking around to the end of this video. If you're making the Lakefield Cowl, I'd love to see your end result. Feel free to tag me in your post on Instagram or add me on Ravelry. If it's your first time on my channel, I'd appreciate you taking the time to like, leave a comment, or subscribe for future videos. I appreciate you spending a little bit of time with me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks. Bye.